probably don't know this about me, but I'm Peruvian, and we emigrated out of Peru in '89 because of a hyperinflationary period, 7,200% in 6 months. And what you saw was in the beginning of it, in the mid 80s, you saw two things, right? Number one is the realization that the government can print money when there's a deflationary situation. You want to bump up the right assets, which is kind of investment assets. But when you start giving money to the people, which is what the president started doing, he started handing out wads of money to people, like literally both, in their bank accounts, but you'd see videos of him going to towns and handing out wads of money. When you put that money into people's pockets, it leads to too much. That's when it leads too much money chasing too few goods, right? Versus what has been happening in the last 30 years, 40 years, which is any liquidity that the Fed injected went to the wealth effect and asset prices for the very wealthy, right? That's the good type of inflation. That's the inflation that helped them deal with when they only had to think about growth dynamics. High growth, let's ease up. Low growth, let's print as much money and add liquidity to the system to get that wealth effect going. And as you said, when the moment you give money in people's pockets, now we have too much money chasing goods that the Fed can't produce, right? The Fed can't create more food, more grains, more copper. That's not in their purview. The economy needs to do that, right? So that's a first order effect. What ended up happening in '89 is that people started anticipating that. And so you would see in the storefronts, people change. They'd have they'd have that that eraser, that's what's it called, the erase marker, and they'd update their prices on an hourly basis. Like the soup would cost something different in the morning than it would in the afternoon. Right. So that's what the Fed was trying to do by saying, oh, it's transitory. We'll get there. Don't worry about it, right? Don't get ahead of me. I'm going to fix this, right? And the question really is, how fixable is this? What would the Fed need to do today to get ahead of inflation? And what would the consequence of getting ahead of inflation be? And now that inflation, for 40 years, inflation has not been a hindrance. It has not been a limiting factor for the Fed, right? True inflation. Now that it is, where can we expect the Fed to be? Will they get ahead of inflation? Will they cause that bomb? Do you have a view of a range here?
Yeah, I mean, look,
where rates can go.
I get this all the time from people, and I've been talking about this for a couple of years, and it's obviously now people are saying, well, look, fiscal happened, but at least people realize that fiscal caused this, so they're not going to do any more, is what people argue, and I think people are missing the complete, the forest from the trees. Politically, this is only making populism worse. And people aren't going to call it, they're not going to call them price controls. They're not going to call it fiscal stimulus. But you better believe they're going to want to help, their constituents with the price increases. And inevitably price controls of some kind happen. This is just what happens. That's what people want help on the bottom. They're being hurt. They're going to come, with pitchforks in the street, if not, and they end up giving money to these people. And you can, you'll get first-time homebuyer tax credits. Watch. You're going to get gas tax holidays. Watch. All these things sound really nice to the public, but they're fiscal stimulus, and they actually make inflation worse. They're little Band-Aids that make people worse. And so the Fed not only has to deal with what's in front of them now, they have to deal with this continued impulse, which is almost inevitable. And it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be sending, $100,000 checks to people. It's not going to be, and there'll be mixes of supply side responses as well. But once this is not something that you can solve in months or even a year or two, and it's almost inevitable that these expectations take hold. The alternative is a depression. The alternative is not feasible or possible politically. It's completely politically unpalatable. And I think that's the key. I mean, you touched on it, and I kind of mentioned it is the difference between monetary and fiscal policy is dramatically misunderstood by policymakers, by individuals, and I think that's what led people to completely miss this. Like, we've already done $25 trillion of stimulus, right? Look at it, it's not inflationary. We're never going to see inflation again, right? But the difference is if you print $25 trillion, put in a little lockbox over here, right? Or a little machine that makes goods, and then you send
or
those
in Jeff
out to the market.
Bezos' bank account and Elon Musk's bank account, where their marginal propensity to spend is zero. Then
Correct.
you're not.
And even worse than they're not willing to spend. Same thing, right? But even worse than not spending, they're going to keep producing things that put big box stores out of business, that put, cab drivers out of business, that make things more efficient and need less inputs, and send jobs overseas and do all the things that makes the system much more efficient, create technological revolution, right? But at the end of the day, not only is that money not entering the market, going into their bank accounts, but they're reinvesting it in things that are ultimately hurting labor, or at least sending less money to labor ultimately.